ladies. I'm Karen Colligan, and welcome to the Let's Talk Leadership podcast. So why do I care about leadership? As a founder of PeopleThink and in my tenure as a leader, a consultant, and a coach, I've certainly seen my share of very good leaders and my share of very bad leaders. And I thought, it'd be great to share the wisdom from the very good leaders. Hence, the Let's Talk Leadership podcast. You're going to hear from a variety of leaders who are in a variety of roles, sharing their leadership expertise by answering the same 6 questions. Every single leader is unique in their style and approach, and we want to capture that uniqueness and provide you, the listener, with a diverse way of looking at leadership. So let's get moving and talk to our next leadership guest. In this episode, I am thrilled to be speaking to Wei-Li Chong, who is the founder of the Culture Playbook Partners. We're going to hear all about Wei-Li's approach to leadership. So Wei-Li, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Karen, hello, how are you?
Great.
Great to be with you.
So Wei-Li, before we get started and have those 6 questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about the Culture Playbook Partners?
Terrific. Absolutely. Yeah, I started the Culture Playbook Partners as a way, I like to think I'm teaching companies how to take the people path to profit. There's so many ways to improve a company's performance, but I really believe in my experience that people and creating productive cultures is the best way to drive sustainable growth. And that partly is because I spent most of my career in human resources, up to being a CHRO for a number of large organizations. But I'm also one of those rare people that moved from HR into operations and ultimately became president of a company called KinderCare, the largest childcare provider, early learning provider in the US, and also MindGym. I was the president of their Americas division. It's a great global behavioral science organization. So taking all of that experience, Karen, and now just really passionate about helping organizations create what I call just high-performing cultures.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about the fact that going from HR to operations, because you're right, that is not an easy leap. And the fact that it's almost like you have 2 sides of your brains, Wei-Li. It's like you got that people side, that empathy, that collaboration. How do we build the best high performing? But then how do you operationalize that? So in fact, it can be sustainable and profitable. So love it. Can't wait to have this conversation. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
All righty. So first things first, we all know there's so many ways to define leadership. And it's because it's so personal to each person, and each person really has to take that time, Wei-Li, to understand who they are as a leader. And so my first question is, how do you define leadership for you?
It's such a great question and probably easily overlooked. And going back to your point, Karen, I started human resources. I really kind of fell into that function, but I always used to describe it as proving the power of talent. With all things mainly created equal, and I worked in multi-unit businesses, why does one location or one team outperform another? And that really was the way that I looked at human resources. So getting to your question of how I define leadership, I really define leadership as creating conditions for excellence. So the way that I describe it is to really understand the difference between what does it mean to lead and what does it mean to manage.
Yes.
Right? Managing, to me, it's all situational. You have a project, you have a problem, you have a situation that you need to get through, and leaders have to deal with some of those things, and that's really about managing.
Yes.
But the very best leader, when you really think about the impact of leadership, it is about creating conditions for other people to excel.
Yeah.
And we can think about, as you said, I work for great leaders. I work for bad leaders. The best leaders really just created these amazing conditions for me to really excel. And that's the way I think about leading and making the impact today.
Yeah. And when you think about what you just said, it's really about allowing the people that work with you in your organization to do what they do best and to make those mistakes and say, okay, you made a mistake. Let's learn from it. What do we do with that? Okay, how do we move forward? But empowering them not to be afraid to be their best. And when you are stretching yourself and trying to be your best, well, there's sometimes it's just not always going to work out. So, I just love creating conditions for excellence. Yes, love that. Okay, good, good. All right. So, number two, the values of a leader. I mean, that really to me is the guiding light. It's really our North Star. It's how we make our decisions, whether they're easy decisions or the really hard decisions. And we have to be really clear about those values. And so for you, Wei-Li, tell us what your top three values and a little bit about what each of those mean.
Yeah, and Karen, just to reiterate your point, when you think about leaders and great leaders I've worked for, they really knew who they were.
Mhm.
Right. And the ones that really struggled, I think, are trying to be something else, and it comes out kind of a bit of a struggle, whether it's just more command and control or do as I say, not as I do. All those little cliches that we've built. So when I think about myself and I think about three values that represent who I am, the first one that comes to mind is authenticity.
Mm.
I think you really have to own the things that you might excel at, but almost be as transparent about the things that you're not good at.
Yes.
And that really helps other people recognize how you need to be supported and where they need to work beyond just a role and so forth. And frankly, I feel like if you're trying to be somebody else at work, it just comes out as not really great, right? So authenticity to me is you get my whole self. If it's a good day, if it's a bad day, things that I'm doing well, things I'm not, it's good to just be authentic and be a real person. So that's the first one. I think the second one is really about embracing change. I've been really fortunate to work for organizations that embrace change, and I was lucky enough to have worked for long periods of time to really work through change, and that's where I thrive. It's really organizations that are looking to transform, taking challenges head on, and driving that. Change is hard,
Yes.
but for me, I say my value is embracing it, embracing the discomfort, embracing the unknown, being able to move forward and in working through those pieces, and then getting to the other side, I think is something that I just cherish.
Well, that's you cherish. Wow, that's a strong word for embracing change because Wei-Li, what we know is most people do not embrace change,
Yeah.
and the status quo works for them because the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. And my guess is with you and how you lead is once that change has been hit head on, once you get through the change, you're like, okay, what's next for me? Because the status quo wouldn't work, obviously. So if I'm going to work for you and you're my leader, I have to know I'm on the train with you. We're getting through it. And then we're getting off that train. We're getting on another train.
You're absolutely right. And I'll tell you, it's probably, I guess I knew this, but it's the biggest aha moment I've had since I started my own company, because prior I was a leader in an organization with great focus in helping that one organization be great. And I was in the role and I was accountable for that. And now that I've started this culture play with partners, helping companies and leaders say, gosh, we know something's not working.
Yes.
We know we need to do something else. But underneath it, Karen, I can tell they're really concerned about that change.
Yeah.
So to help them lean in and support them in the best way and help them really see the path forward is something. It's a little bit different version than I'm used to in terms of embracing change, and I love it. I've really had a great time with it.
And that's the piece where the emotional intelligence really comes in from a leader perspective, that self-awareness, understanding I'm a little afraid of this change and I'm still going to embrace it the best I can, work through it because I need to for my team. Because if my team sees that I have some anxiety around it, we all know stuff falls downhill. And
That's
so
right.
that is exactly what will happen to the team. So it's like, keep that stiff upper lip, knowing that there will be a light at the end of the tunnel.
And it's amazing how many companies today, you just look at what we've been dealing with the last 2 to 3 years. And the reality is a lot of organizations are not moving forward because their leaders have not leaned into the discomfort.
Right.
So it's all, I hear so many times, well, this is how we've always done it, or this is how I've always worked. Well, things are changing.
Yes.
So how well can you lean into those things and recognize that just because we worked a certain way doesn't necessarily mean the next group or the next workforce really sees that as the most productive way to work.
And did it always work? Of course it didn't. That's another evaluation to do. However, we want to hear your third value.
So my third value, gosh, I wonder if this is even a value. So you can keep me honest about this, but okay. I thought about, I really value pragmatism. And I say pragmatism because in most of my jobs, I think about KinderCare. I certainly think about Mind Gym, being in HR, talking about theories of human behavior, thinking about approaches. What really drives me crazy is this idea of intellectual tourists, right? So you spending time in rooms and just talking about points of view and theories and research and so forth. And as much as I know that is important to do that, at some point, you have to decide what to do.
Yes.
And I think a lot of organizations struggle, they get paralyzed. And in particularly in today's age where we are just living in polarization,
yes,
I think companies get paralyzed because it's sort of, one debate around one point of view and another. I recognize that Mind Gym, who has amazing perspective, but at the end of the day, when you think about psychology and research, you can find a point of view or research to back up your point of view, regardless of what your point of view is.
Yes.
So at some point, how do you be practical and pragmatic to recognize what's going to help us in this situation to move forward? And for me, it's about progress, and it's about just making meaningful progress in the best way.
Yeah. And what I was going to say was in terms of, that practical is at some point we can theorize all that we want. We can be in those meetings, and there's days, I'm sure all of us feel the same way. It's like, really, do we have to go through this again? But it's the action that happens based on those conversations. But there has to be a point where the conversations end and reality sets in. Yeah. And that's really important for any organization. And to go back to your intellectual tourist, I love that. It's like, who's the show off in the room? And as my dad used to say growing up, is nobody likes a show off. So it's that whole thing. Sometimes you sit back. So I love the idea of being practical and going into action, because at the end of the day, we've got numbers to meet. We've got customers that we need to satisfy. We need employees that need to be engaged. So, there's a lot around that. And I'll go back to what we just talked about, Wei-Li. If employees are watching their leaders cycle and cycle and cycle, what does that tell them? Oh, well, if my leader can't make a decision, why do I have to make a decision?
That's exactly right. And you think about where companies are distorting their time now. And this is where my world of HR and business operators kind of collide. Yeah. I look at things, and I don't know, this may be controversial to some of your viewers, but an example to me is unconscious bias training.
Yes.
There's so much focus in just talking about biases and so forth. The reality is the research shows that helping people get clarity around their bias actually promotes greater bias. But when you think about the outcome of what you're trying to do, when you think about what organizations are trying to do, create a world that is more inclusive, to your point, I start with what's the business impact of that? Can you create more innovation? Yes, you can. So how do you actually drive a business outcome through some of these pieces versus what's happening today? Billions of dollars are being spent just frankly creating much more polarization, much more bias with good intent, but yes, just stuck in this perpetual idea of just education.
Yeah. Oh, I agree completely in terms of the intent is there, the goodness is there. However, it can also solidify one's viewpoint based on the training So, that's a whole different conversation to have. No
Absolutely.
question about that. And we have to drive the business. At the end of the day, you have a firm, I have a firm. At the end of the day, we have to drive in business impact for our customers. End of story, period.
Absolutely right.
All right. So my third question, obviously, you've mentioned it already. We're going through an enormous amount of transition and change. Yes, we are. Between the global pandemic, the social awakening, the economic implications, and that's really raising its head these days. How do you lead through that transition and change? So you say, and we talked about it, that's one of your values, embracing change. But what do you do systematically in order to embrace that change, Wei-Li?
Yeah, you think about what's happening in the world today. It's sort of, where do you start and how do you actually approach the situation? It reminds me, Karen, when I first joined KinderCare, this was in 2012. I was a CHRO. It was a company in distress. 14 quarters of decline. They lost over $100 million to the bottom line in a small margin business.
Wow.
Very, very tough situation. To either more complicate that, our employees, 30,000 employees, almost 1,500 locations, we studied their engagement. They were in the bottom quartile of employee engagement with the Gallup survey. So imagine we're taking care of families, children under the age of 6, and here's a workforce that frankly hates being part of the organization. And the amazing part, when you think about that transformation, we took the company on 25 quarters of growth. We moved from bottom quartile to top quartile engagement. We started enrolling families 3 to 4 times the industry average. We're really proud of that. And I give that example because I look at this situation that we're in today. You could look at whether it's COVID, hybrid working, DE&I, in the economic challenge. There's 2 things that I think leaders need to do to really lead through these challenges. One is to lead with empathy. And really being curious and listening to other people. It's really challenging right now with this polarized world, the world we're in. It's kind of like everyone's double downing on their point of view. Right. Empathy, really put yourselves in the shoes of others, to be curious around what they're going through. I think there's a lot we can learn. Our biggest movement at KinderCare was frankly going out and talking to teachers and parents. And guess what? The corporate office did not have an idea of what was most important to them. So we really led with empathy, and we started to make decisions that made the most sense to them. So this situation really takes the same. Listen to your workforce and really lead with empathy around what they're going through. And then the second thing is to have courage. And that's, I wouldn't underestimate the courage it takes to lead through these challenges. It requires companies to work really different, which frankly takes leaders. It requires leaders to have courage to say, we're going to try something different. And that's really hard. So, I was just working with a client with this hybrid working piece, and they've really embraced this idea of empowered flexibility, is what they call it. I thought that was a great term, but it is they work in a very traditional industry that requires people to be at work every single day. There's a new CEO in place. It's a really big organization with a big corporate office, but she has said, we're going to embrace this idea of empowered flexibility. It takes a lot of courage to say, we want people to make their decision around where they work, but we have to make sure they know the outcomes we need them to deliver. And as long as they know the outcomes they delivered, we need to empower them to have the flexibility that they need in their own personal lives. And so that courage to really put a stake in the ground and say, this is where we're going, I think is the second piece.
Yeah. So you said 2 things: lead with empathy, really make sure that you're listening to the workforce, and courage. Now, I'm going to go back to that first question about how do you define leadership? And Wei-Li, you and I have both been in enough organizations to recognize that doesn't always happen. And in order to get to this place of embracing change, to use your words for your values, but to go to this question about how do you lead in change, self-awareness. I mean, I can't be empathetic and courageous if I'm not sure about who I am as a leader. And so it's so foundational. And so what you're saying to me is like, duh, of course. And yet that's not true in the work world that we currently are in. So yeah, lead with empathy and have courage. And it's scary to have both because you're being vulnerable in number one and you're being vulnerable in number two. And at
Yeah.
the end of the day, that can be scary for people.
And Karen, just, I think there's so much research right now around why people are leaving their jobs. And there's a high percentage of people leaving their industry or doing something completely different. I think generally most people are looking to follow leaders that embrace that approach. And they're realizing just because you go to another industry doesn't mean that there's just a lot of great leaders out there. And sadly, I think a lot of leaders really struggle with some of the things that you and I are like, yeah, that's pretty obvious, but it's really hard to do. And I think that leaders need to embrace that and really get comfortable being uncomfortable, because I think the employees that are out there, and I'm talking about the non-exempts, which are the ones that are leaving in droves, they're looking for leadership. They're looking to align values. They're looking to follow somebody that they can really connect with.
Yes. And I do a leadership power hour lead so people stay. And one of the things we say is, why are people staying? And it goes back to what you just said, because it's purposeful for them and that they align with the values of the organization, which then means, Wei-Li, that the values of the organization have been not only shown, but they're lived. And that's how the culture, which of course, this is what you do for a living. And it's really, again, when you go back to the very simplistic pieces of the workforce, they want to know they are valued and that what they do is purposeful. So, it goes, and that's all emotional. That's all intrinsic. It's not about compensation and it's not about pay and all that. I mean, that should be a foundational piece that nobody even talks about. It's what do I feel like when I open that door, either figuratively or physically. So I'm right there with you.
Well, I tell you, just to add one thing to what you said, it's sad that right now culture has become such this soft, touchy feely thing.
What?
Right? It's become the do you have a ping pong table in the lobby type of conversation, which is so ridiculous. And I think people are proving that culture is something that is really tangible. I define culture as the acceptable behaviors in an organization that ultimately drive the performance of that company. So is it acceptable to treat people a certain way? Is it acceptable to show up late to a meeting? Is it acceptable that everybody feels like they need to go to a meeting because that's the only way they're going to get the information they need to do their job? All those things define your culture. All those things define how they're going to perform. So the more organizations that really see that and recognize, as you said, it's these elements of leadership that are coming to life, they're going to see a very clear connection to their performance.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, great. So we know the best leaders are curious and always learning. And so what do you do? What are your resources? What are your tools so that you make sure that you are growing and you are developing?
It's funny. I was working with a client just last week, and it was a head of HR and a CEO, and they're looking to transform their organization. And I was leaving, the CHRO said, I'm really looking to learn. Are there certain HR podcasts and things that I should be looking at or listening to learn? And I said, so my best advice is, don't listen to HR podcasts, because it's almost like its own little, echo chamber of perspective. And this kind of goes back to just being really, really curious. I'm a student of others, period. And whether it's documentaries, which I love documentaries because there's great lessons around just people and events and how they're able to move forward. And documentaries are a great way to not only just listen and learn, but then to think about how does that apply to the world that we're in. I have two daughters that are now pretty much adults, and I'm a student of theirs. fascinating
Yes.
how they live and work and things they take for granted, how they study, how they communicate. That's the next generation. And so I am fully a student of them, whether they know it or not.
Yeah.
I want to learn from them in what motivates them, what inspires them, because I think that's going to be the next chapter of the next workforce. So I think about those pieces. If there's anything I read, an example, Karen, would be All Sides. All Sides it's a great newsletter. I think they've got a podcast as well. It's a perspective they take on topics, but they show every side of the
Oh.
argument.
Mhm.
And I find that to be really interesting because I am the anti-echo chamber person. I know polarization is so incredibly hard for us to deal with. So I am constantly thinking about what is my point of view, but what's the other point of view. All Sides is a great place to kind of get that perspective.
And I have to say, Wei-Li, that's hard to do sometimes when we really have a strong belief system based on our values, based on the self-awareness, based on the work we've done. And it's really hard at times to listen, as you said earlier, to others' opinions. Now I can listen to them and then I have to think about, okay, how do I take that information and actually digest it so that I might be able to review how I see things. And it takes courage, which we've talked about before, to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it goes back to that empathy and courage, particularly in this place. How do you balance those
Yeah.
things? It's hard. But if you think about those pieces, I was given great advice in my first job. At that time, he was the head of HR, and he said to me, "You'll be successful in your career if you figure out how to be humble and confident at the same time." And I thought that was it stuck with me for now almost 3 decades. And I think that's a different bent around empathy and courage. But how do you be humble and recognize that you can learn something from anybody, and
Yeah.
you have to have your ears open for that. But you have to have the confidence to know that you're being paid to do something, which
Yes.
requires you to make decisions and take information, say, I've learned enough. Now we've got to go in this direction, and be accountable for that. I think that's a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah, it is. And the accountability piece is really big. No question about that. So humble and confident. Like you said, the words might have changed, but it's kind of the same thing. Yeah. All right. Okay, great. So number 5, how do you give the people that you work with those opportunities to grow, those opportunities to develop? So you're a student of others. How do you help your teams become students of others?
I think a big part of that is giving them experiences that take them out of their comfort zone. Yeah, I think about that leader that gave me the advice around humble and confident. I was part of this, is fresh out of college. I was part of this executive development program, and the program requires you to rotate every year. So you basically had a new job every year. But what made that program really special in my mind, and I've carried it through, is that every rotation you had to give a presentation around how to make the function you're in better.
Oh,
And the interesting thing was you presented your ideas to the highest level of the organization. So there was a lot of pressure to it. But it really instilled the experiences that you get every single day with this idea of it has to get better. There's always this idea of continuous improvement. That's really stuck with me. Maybe that's why I embrace change. I don't know. But, I just thought I really think about that a lot. And I think, answering a question on how do you give people that development and growth, it's recognized helping them understand who they are, but giving them the opportunities to challenge status quo, to get experiences that have them feel uncomfortable, and just allow them to see that they could see an opportunity. They're able to identify what needs to be different, and then giving them the empowerment to actually drive that change. When I think about people I've had the benefit of working with, or people that have been on my team, and I look at where they are today, I'm really proud of the experiences that we've made together to see where they are today. They are CHROs. They a lot of them have left HR and now one's leading a digital transformation. There's a lot of different things, and I think it's because they really understood their own talent. Yes. And they understood the opportunity, and they're taking some of these things and really being successful doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I think about development for others, it's also the question to ask them, where do you want to go? How do you want to get there? Let me give you ideas, and to have that conversation, to plant those seeds, Wei-Li, so that they are really thinking about tomorrow and recognizing that, there are great possibilities. What are they? And then to begin to explore. So that's fabulous.
It's sort of this idea of just doing your job well and going to other developments may not help you grow depending on where you want your career path to be. And the ones that really accelerate, I believe, are the ones that really put themselves in a position to learn more about themselves and their talents, and the ones that really challenge status quo and are able to influence others towards change. Yeah. I think that's a big differentiator for those who grow.
Absolutely. Okay. So last, and of course, not least, what piece of art or music or literature or whatever else keeps you balanced and brings you joy? With joy being the operative word. Because if we're not a whole person going to work as leaders or as just individual performers, forget about the rest of the day. So what brings you that joy?
When you were saying art and culture and those, culture kind of popped into my mind. I'm a big foodie. So, if you see me on the weekend, my wife and I are probably trying to find a different place to experience culture, learn about people, but we love to do that through food. And I think that's such a great place. When I think about what gives me joy, I've had the benefit of living in a lot of different places, from the Midwest to the Northwest, Southeast. Now I'm in the Northeast, picking up something, learning something in that area. So my mind goes to when I lived in Oregon for almost 10 years and I learned how to fly fish. And that's kind of a wild experience. If you've never stood in a river, I recommend it highly. But, what gives me joy is that, experiencing life, being with my family and kind of challenging myself to learn things and learning about culture.
Nice. Yeah. Love it. Thank you. So, Wei-Li, thank you. Thank you so much. Loved having this conversation. I could just go on and on and on. I feel like I should add 3 more questions at least to it, and I won't, I promise. Really inspiring to hear what you're doing. I love how you started your company and how you're motivated by empowering organizations to give their employees the courage to embrace change. It's beautiful. Love it. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on, Karen. I think it's a simple and brilliant approach to ask people the same questions. I know there's a lot of value of just hearing everybody's story. So thank you. Really a privilege to be on.
Great. Love it. Yeah. And I have to tell you, it's crazy how much I've learned and how distinct each leader is. It's really been mind-boggling for me to learn. So everyone, thanks for listening. I'm Karen Colligan, and you've been listening to Wei-Li Chong, the founder of the Culture Playbook Partners. So if this leadership podcast was of interest to you, go to our YouTube channel, People Think SF, and look at all the other distinguished leaders I've had the pleasure of interviewing. You're going to learn so much about the uniqueness of leaderships. I know I have. And don't forget to share it with your colleagues. Till the next episode of the Let's Talk Leadership podcast, have a good one, and don't forget to keep it real. Music by Poddington Bear and editing by Mary Lee Williams. Thanks again. We'll talk soon. Bye now.